my gosh, it's so nice to see the chat moving. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that, it's working, because if I'm just sitting here talking to myself, that wouldn't be very fun for me or anyone else. So this is an astrology chart. Usually when I pull up an astrology chart in a reading and somebody is unfamiliar with astrology, they're like, what the hell is all of that? And I get it. It's very intimidating when you first start, because like, what is all of this? What are we doing here? Oops. I keep moving stuff on my screen. Sorry. We're getting situated. All right. So this is Gene Hackman's chart. And so when you're looking at an astrology chart, it helps to know that this is a map of the planets at the moment of a given event. And in this case, the event is Gene Hackman's birth. And we have this information because somebody did research, somebody got birth records and verified that, on Gene Hackman's birth certificate, this is the time and place that he was born. So he was actually born, let me pull that up because it's not on the screen. So Gene Hackman was born January 30th, 1930. So he really did live a good long life, at 7:45 a.m. in San Bernardino, California, not too far from where I am. And so that is actually where all of these lines and squiggles came from. This is actually a reflection of the location that he was born and the time that he was born, and I will explain. So when you're looking at a chart, this side right here, every single chart, this is always going to be east. And then the opposite side of the chart here is west. And then the bottom of the chart here, north. Top of the chart, south. So all this to say, this is all directional. So if you were, let me move this so you can see what I'm writing. So if you were standing here in the middle in San Bernardino at the moment that Gene Hackman was born, this line right down the middle here is the horizon. So this is the ground. Everything above this line would be visible in the sky. So if you had really good eyes or a telescope, you could have seen Saturn in the sky. You could have seen Mercury. You could have seen Mars, Venus, the sun. He was born during the daytime, so the sun was above the horizon. The moon was also above the horizon. So was Neptune. Neptune's pretty far out there, so probably would have been harder to see, but technically, yeah. And then everything below this line would have been below the horizon, would not have been visible from San Bernardino at the moment that Gene Hackman was born. So we're going to erase all of this so we can get back without all of my drawings all over it. So all this to say is that this is an actual map. If you were standing in San Bernardino at the moment that Gene Hackman was born and you wanted to figure out where Saturn was, you could actually use this to identify what part of the sky Saturn was in, which is pretty cool. And I think most people, when they look at what this is, it's not clear if you've never seen an astrology chart before that that's exactly what we're looking at. So that's what we're looking at. And so another important thing to know is the rising sign. Usually when people come to astrology, they know that that's a thing, maybe, but they don't really know what it means or what it represents. And so remember how I said that this line right here is the horizon? So the rising sign is the same thing as the horizon. That's where that word comes from. So on any chart that you look at, this part right here, the rising sign, it's always going to be in the same spot. And in this case, the sign right here is Aquarius. So the sign of Aquarius was on the horizon at the moment that Gene Hackman was born. So he was an Aquarius rising. That's what a rising sign means. And so that's the first astrology chart mystery that I like to share with people. Usually I do this at the beginning of my natal chart reading so that people aren't distracted by all of this. And so the way that I approach astrology is that all of these symbols here, which represent planets, so all of these are planets or luminaries, which I'll get into. And then we've got some other things on here, which I'll also talk about, that are not planets. But the way that I look at astrology is that the energy of a particular moment, any given moment, so the energy of this particular moment that Gene Hackman was born, the energy of where the planets are, how they're interacting with each other on a symbolic level is representative of the energy that Gene Hackman had as a person. And so that's why an astrologer, a good astrologer, can look at an astrology chart and tell you about yourself because the energy of that particular moment is manifesting physically through that person or that event or whatever it may be. If something, and I'm sure things happened at the moment that Gene Hackman was born, the chart would be the same. You'd read it a little bit differently if it's not for a person. But all this to say is, like, that's what an astrology chart is. You're capturing the energy of a specific moment. And so the really cool thing about astrology is that the moment that you were born, your astrology chart captures the energy of that moment, and so do you. You're a physical manifestation of that particular moment. So I think I kind of look at it as like a cosmic fingerprint. The energy that each and every one of us carries. And the way that I look at the universe is that everything is made of energy. And this is something that we explore in physics as well. I'm not a physicist, but that's the energy that I'm referring to. And so when we talk about astrology, we're just describing energy. And it's just a really in-depth way of describing energy. So that's kind of the basics of how we start approaching an astrology chart. And so if you'll notice, there are tons of planets, and everybody, depending on what kind of astrology you practice, not all astrologers use all planets. But for the sake of today, I use all of the planets. And another thing to know is that, the sun and the moon are not planets, technically, on a astronomical level. Like, I know that. But it's easier to say planets than just constantly being like planets and luminaries, planets and luminaries. The sun and the moon are technically luminaries. It's kind of a shorthand to just say planets, but the sun, so this is the sun right here. I can draw better than that. This symbol right here, the circle with the dot in the middle, that is the sun. And then this is the moon. The moon, usually people know that symbol already. So those are the luminaries. But the sun, moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, so all of these right here are personal planets. And what that means is that those indicate your personality. Those can tell us different things about a person's personality, what they are like to be around, what they value, how they take action, how their mind works. So it's interesting that Gene Hackman has all of his personal planets kind of over in this section of his chart. It's not always like that. It really just depends on the moment that you were born. But it is always interesting when there is kind of like a concentration of certain stuff in certain places. So these are personal planets. They indicate a personality. And then we also have Saturn and Jupiter, which are called social planets. These are planets, it's not that they're not important, but they are indicators of the social forces that shaped us. And so that also can tell us about a person. It's just not describing their personality necessarily. And then we've also got the outer planets. And some astrologers that are like Hellenistic astrologers that practice in a very strict way, may not use these outer planets because they were not discovered. Like back in ancient Greece, they did not use these outer planets because they didn't know they existed. They're actually pretty recently discovered. So that would be Uranus. And we've got Neptune's also an outer planet, and then Pluto, which I know somebody is going to be like, Pluto's not a planet. In astrology, it's a planet. We'll just end there. We'll just say that. And so these are a little bit less personal. They move very slowly. It's not that they don't have an impact on us, but the impact is more subtle. And everybody that is born in the same year or years close together is going to have pretty similar things going on with these outer planets because they move so slowly. And so, we don't want to overemphasize, not that they don't play a role, but they play a bit of a different role than the other planets in an astrology chart. And so that's the planets. Those are the planets. And it is important if you're trying to get better at astrology, if you're trying to learn how to read a chart, it's important to know what these symbols mean and start learning how to sight read, because it becomes like, for me, I've been doing this for a while now, and it's like second nature, And at first, I remember thinking like, man, this is a lot to memorize. It's just like reading. It's just like learning your ABCs. Like the more that you engage with the stuff, the easier it is to tell right off the bat what you're looking at. So if I had to give advice to people that are trying to get a handle on this, I would say practice writing these symbols over and over. Practice using them instead of writing Neptune or Uranus or whatever it is. So another thing to talk about is that not everything in an astrology chart is a planet. So I'm going to point out a couple things in this chart just so you get an idea. I don't have any asteroids on here. I know that asteroids are really popular. So if you look up astrology stuff or you look at a chart, a lot of astrologers do use asteroids. My personal opinion as an astrologer who's been practicing professionally for a few years now is that it's not that they're not important, but I think asteroids are really just like, they're very subtle. And I don't think that they're worth diving into, especially for beginners, because until you have a handle on the planets, the signs, the houses, and aspects, I don't think it's even worth going there. Sometimes people will really focus on these things because some of the asteroids can be very specific in the way that they're described, and I just don't think that information is really necessary. Like you can get plenty of that information from just knowing the things that I just mentioned. So that's why you don't see any asteroids on my chart. Another thing to know is that there are calculation points. So like, for example, these are the north and south nodes of the moon. And so I've talked about these on a recent episode of my podcast, Petty Astrology. And the nodes are a calculation point, which means math. There is math that relates to the position of the sun, the position of the moon, and the position of the earth. That's how these calculations are made. And they kind of are indicators of direction and momentum. Another thing that's pretty subtle in an astrology chart, but that's what these are. So sometimes there's stuff in an astrology chart it's not a physical thing that you can see in the sky. This would be one of them. Another one would be the parts. And so this is the part of fortune, which is, it's kind of a whole other thing that I probably won't get into. It's not really a beginner topic, but if you see this symbol, that is the part of fortune. That can also give us some different information. But again, it's kind of a subtle thing. And so not everything that you see in an astrology chart is necessarily a planet. Another important thing to look at in an astrology chart, and we'll zoom in for this one, is how do we tell like where the position of something in a chart is? We do that with degrees. So these are degrees, kind of like, if you look at the temperature. So Gene Hackman's moon is at 19 degrees of Aquarius. And then the smaller division of that is minutes. So it's at 19 degrees and 24 minutes. And if you'll notice in this astrology chart, in all astrology charts, everything ascends counterclockwise. So let me see. So for example, we've got Jean's Mercury here is at 22 degrees of Capricorn. So if you continue going counterclockwise, it goes up. So then you see the Mars at 24 degrees. There are 29 degrees in every single sign. That's constant. It doesn't matter what astrology chart you're looking at. It starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 29 degrees. And then the other thing that will not change in an astrology chart is the order of the signs. So this is actually a really important thing to learn if you are a beginner, what order the signs are in. So let's say, first of all, important to also know that no matter what astrology chart you're looking at, it's going to always have all 12 signs in it. And so that includes you and your birth chart. You have all 12 signs in your chart. So if there's a sign that you really hate, that's also a part of you, which is a fun thing to kind of think about. But every time you look at an astrology chart, it's always going to have the same 12 signs. So those 12 signs, Aries is always the first sign. Always, always, always. And see, it's not at the beginning. The rising sign is technically like the beginning of a chart. It always starts the first house. So this is the first house here. So just because it's first doesn't mean it's going to be first in the chart, if that makes sense. Back up and erase some of my scribbles here. So we always start with Aries in terms of the order of the zodiac. The next sign is Taurus. The next sign after that is Gemini. The next sign after that is Cancer. And then I'll come back to what's going on here because I think that's an important thing to talk about. The sign after Cancer is Leo. And then after that, we get Virgo. After that, Libra. After that, Scorpio. Then we have Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and then, oops, lost my pen. And then Pisces. Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. So it's important to know that that is always the order. It's never going to be like, oh, Libra and then Cancer. No, always goes in that order. We always move counterclockwise around the chart. Unless something is retrograde, but generally speaking. But we'll get into that. Do we have any questions so far? It was a good moment. If anything is not making sense, I'd love to take some questions. Hey Shelby, nice to see you. All right, we'll keep it moving. So, one important thing about there's only 12 signs. That's a really good important point that Mackenzie just made. There is no 13th sign. You might hear a lot of shit online that's just not true about astrology. One of them is, and it comes up every once in a while, it's like, oh, there's another sign. There's another, you might be a different sign. There's only 12 signs. there's only 12 signs. That's pretty well established. So they're never going to discover like a 13th sign. So we're all good there. But this is the order of the zodiac. It is always going to be the order of the zodiac. There's no surprises coming on that side of things. All right. So an important thing to also know is that those signs, each sign is ruled by a planet or multiple planets, actually. So we'll talk about that. So let's start with Aries. This is the symbol for Aries. It's like a little ram's head. We'll zoom in so everybody can see it. There we go. All right, so this is Aries. And so the sign of Aries is always, always, always ruled by the planet Mars. And this is what Mars looks like. We usually know that symbol. So it's important to know that planets rule over signs. So this is also something that if you're learning astrology is going to be very important. So second sign is Taurus. Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus is also a symbol that usually people that aren't astrologers recognize. Taurus is always ruled by Venus. Then we've got Gemini. Gemini is always ruled by Mercury. And then we have Cancer. Cancer looks like, I'll let you tell, I mean, you know what it looks like. And Cancer is always ruled by the moon. Another symbol that most of us will recognize. And then after that, we have Leo. If you know Leos, you might not be surprised to know that they are ruled by the sun. The sun is the center of the universe. And then we've got Virgo. Oh, my goodness, I shrunk the whiteboard here. All right. Virgo is also ruled by Mercury. So if you'll notice, I mentioned that Gemini was ruled by Mercury. So in this case, Mercury rules two signs. And that's another interesting thing to dive into, is like the difference between the way that Mercury expresses in the sign of Gemini versus how it expresses in the sign of Virgo. Very different expressions. And yet both ruled by the same planet, different sides of the same planet, which if you know anything about Mercury, it's given verse. It's given verse. All right. Next we have Libra. Libra is also ruled by Venus. So that's another thing. If you remember what I said about Taurus, Venus also rules Taurus. So that's two different sides of the Venusian energy. Another thing to look at. Then we got Scorpio. Here's where things start getting interesting. So Scorpio in old school astrology, meaning before we knew Pluto was a planet, was ruled by Mars. But then we discovered Pluto. And Pluto also co-rules Scorpio. Sorry, I'm reading the chat and and teaching. And so both Mars and Pluto rule over Scorpio. So this is the first sign in the zodiac that has multiple planetary rulers. So that's another thing to dive into, is the difference in energy between Mars and Pluto. And then we've got Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter. That's Jupiter here. And then we have Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn. So Gene Hackman had his Saturn in Scorpio, which is just right at home there, given that it is ruled by Saturn. And then we have Aquarius. This is another sign that has two rulerships. So back in the old days, when we only knew that the universe, or our solar system rather, went out to Saturn. Saturn was the end. It was the big daddy end of the solar system as far as people of a certain time knew. And then we discovered more planets, starting with Uranus. And so Uranus and Saturn co-rule Aquarius. And then the last sign of the zodiac is Pisces. And today is the Pisces new moon. So we will be talking more specifically about Pisces energy later. But Pisces is co-ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter back in the old day, just they as far as they were concerned, Jupiter was the only planet that ruled Pisces. And then Neptune was discovered. And so now Jupiter and Neptune co-rule Pisces. All right. So I know I've been talking for a minute, but that's just like the very tip of the iceberg of an astrology chart. And it's already a lot. That's already a lot to digest. But now we know what it is that we're looking at. And so the last thing that I want to really touch on here is another important piece of these charts, and I kind of touched on it a little bit already, is the houses. And so if you'll notice as we zoom out here, let's see. So every chart that you look at, whether it's a birth chart, whether it's an event chart, is always going to have 12 houses. And the houses are these slices of pie around the wheel. And you'll notice that they all have numbers. They're all nicely labeled, so we know what the hell we're looking at, right? And so 12 houses, always going to be 12. And now another thing that when we're new to astrology, the term cusps might have a different meaning to us. So sometimes you'll hear people say, you know, I was born on such and such date. I'm on the cusp between this Leo and Virgo, whatever it is, because they're on the last or first day of that sign. There are actually no cusps in astrology in that sense, because if you pull up somebody's chart, they're either going to be what their sun sign, there's only one sun sign is what I'm trying to say. You're never going to be almost another sign. So usually when people are saying that, they're referring to the sun. So for example, if this sun was like at 29 degrees of Aquarius, it would be really close to the edge of the sign. And so somebody might be like, oh, I'm on the cusp of Aquarius and Pisces. You either are an Aquarius sun or a Pisces sun. And so that's one of the nice things when you pull up an astrology chart, when you calculate it yourself, you get clarity on that. So as far as an astrologer is concerned, that type of cusp doesn't exist. It's you're one or the other. Now, the real meaning of cusps in astrology is these lines. That's what they're called. The lines between houses are called cusps. So it's important to know that just so you don't confuse the meaning. But those cusps are also pretty important when you dive deeper into astrology. And the reason being, let's look at, so if somebody was like, what is on the cusp of Gene Hackman's third house? Somebody really wants to know. So this is Gene Hackman's third house, and this is the sign of Taurus. It's on the cusp. It's on the cusp. And so that'll give us certain information about Gene Hackman's third house, given that that sign is on the cusp. It's at the start of the third house. So the cusp of the first house is always going to be that rising sign. So can anyone tell me what the cusp of Gene Hackman's first house is? Anybody in the chat? It's not a gotcha. It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure that I'm making sense. What is the cusp of Gene Hackman's first house? Anybody? It's okay. Even if you're a pro, you can answer the question. People are being hella quiet tonight because it's the Pisces new moon and everybody wants to be asleep. Yes, Shelby, it's Aquarius. Thank you so much. So it is important. It tells us something like, for example, the rising sign being Aquarius, the first house cusp being Aquarius is pretty significant because the rising sign tells us about somebody's physical appearance. It tells us about kind of the first impression that they give to people in the world. So, you know, Gene Hackman was probably kind of a unique person when you met him. Kind of stood out a little bit, maybe just kind of marched to the beat of his own drum in some way, which would be that Aquarius energy expressing. So it is important to be able to identify like what sign is on a given cusp. All right. Another thing that I wanted to mention, because I am an astrologer who uses Placidus, and so if you're getting into astrology, sometimes you might encounter charts that look kind of different than this one. And so it's important to know that astrologers have different house systems that they use to draw an astrology chart. So what I mean by that is that there will be different math. So if, for example, I was using whole sign, which I do not use, but if I was using whole sign, Gene Hackman's entire first house would be the sign of Aquarius, the whole first house. And it would be one sign per house. So it would look very different. I use Placidus, and one of the reasons why I think a lot of people choose not to use Placidus is because they think it's confusing or it's just harder to read. And I understand why. And it's okay that it's difficult or takes a little time to get used to. But one thing that people find difficult about using Placidus or not using like a whole sign house is interceptions. And interceptions are something that are a little bit more advanced, but I'm going to talk about them just briefly here because if you take any of my classes, if you do any astrology stuff with me, I will be using Placidus. So it's important to me that people be able to read it and not be freaked out by it because it's not as hard as it looks. So you may have noticed, perhaps, that two house cusps here have the same sign. And if you notice, it'll always be the same on the opposite side of the chart. So these are opposite signs. This is Cancer and this is Capricorn. So for example, like it'll never be two Cancer cusps and one Capricorn cusp. It's always going to be 2 and 2. That's just how it works. If you notice that everything on an astrology chart is pretty much the same on either side. You know, this house over here is just as wide as this because they're connected, right? So it kind of mirrors the other side. That will always be true. And so this is what confuses people, that you can have multiple of the same sign on house cusps. So when a sign is intercepted, let me back up here. This is what they're talking about. The sign of Pisces and the sign of Virgo here are what we would call intercepted. And the reason that they are considered intercepted is if you notice, Pisces and Virgo are not touching these cusps. They're just floating out there, all alone, in the first house and the 7th house. You see that? And so that's what an intercepted sign is. And in a chart that has an intercepted sign, there will also be intercepted houses. And an intercepted house is when the house has the same sign on both cusps. You see that? All right. I'm going to show you a different chart that doesn't have interceptions, so we can also... This is actually the chart for the new moon that we just had a little while ago. So if you notice in this chart, so I'm going to use Pisces and Virgo because that was our example on the previous chart. They got cusps here. They're not intercepted. Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone understand? We don't freak out with interceptions. It's okay. They're okay. They're okay. We just look at things a little bit differently. But these are not intercepted. There's no intercepted houses or signs in this Pisces new moon chart. So that's what a chart looks like. Not everybody has interceptions in their chart. I don't have interceptions in my birth chart. And this is another really important thing. Interceptions are not bad. They don't make you less than. They don't mean there's something wrong with you. It's not a curse. It's not something you have to reverse. Oh, I'm out of focus. There we go. I'm back. And so there's nothing wrong with having an interception. We don't interception shame. It just means that you read that part of the chart a little bit differently. And I won't get too deep into that today, but I just wanted to address that it's a thing. Gene Hackman had interceptions, right? He is an incredible actor that made some really amazing films, and he inhabited his roles so fully, which I would put down to, he's a 12th houser. This is somebody who could immerse himself in his chosen reality. He had a Venus sun, and moon in that 12th house. Very creative and imaginative individual. And honestly, like quite visionary, I would say as well. And just somebody that I think was an out of the box type of person. Also, that intercepted Pisces in there probably helped him out in immersing himself in the characters that he took on. So there's nothing wrong with having an interception, but it is something to just know when you're looking at an astrology chart. And then the last thing that I really wanted to talk about, just briefly, because this is more advanced stuff. I would get down all of the stuff that I've mentioned so far. I would kind of look at that stuff before I started diving into aspects. And aspects are these lines. So usually people are like, what the hell is that like spider web going on in the middle of the astrology chart? That is aspects. And so let's look at sextiles first, okay? So this is a sextile right here. This line with the little asterisk right there. It's like a little shorty, okay? And a sextile, so a sextile, this is actually a really, really close sextile given that Saturn is at 7 degrees and the south node here is at 7 degrees. So all this is a specific angle that Saturn is making to the south node that we describe as a sextile. So that's what that line means. And there's a few of them here. Got a few different sextiles going on in here, if you'll notice. So that little asterisk line, that is a sextile. And so it just indicates a certain energetic interaction between 2 points in a chart. That can be between two planets. It can be between, a calculation point and a planet, like I just showed you. It can also be, let's find a good one here. So we've got a trine here. So we've got Gene Hackman's, his Venus and his Sun are both trine his IC. And the IC is always going to be the line that starts the 4th house in a chart in Placidus. So in this case, it's not an object in the chart. This is an angle. And it is also important to know that there are some specific angles in the chart that are important. So the ascendant is one. The descendant is another. The IC is another. And the MC, which is always at the top of the chart starting the 10th house in Placidus, those are really important angles. They kind of just give us a little bit more information about you as a person than other angles in the chart. I don't know why I keep going out of focus, but very Pisces. But most importantly, we can see the damn chart. All right, so I think that was the most of what I wanted to cover. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've said about an astrology chart, or questions about astrology charts in general? I would love to answer them. I hope it all made sense. I hope this was a good starting point for people who are new to astrology. I hope Gene Hackman is feeling good about himself, where, God rest his soul. Kind of a weird situation, it sounds like, with his passing. So I'm hoping that we get some clarity about what happened to him. But he lived a really long, really amazing life.